So listening to Mervyn King there and thinking about the crisis 10 years ago, is the big lesson, as he said, as he referred to there, that you can't let these banks fail, but it has to come with conditions? Is that the uncomfortable truth that we learned in the financial crisis?
Well, that is certainly true, but there's another phrase of his which I heard, and that is that the banks are safe, but not safe enough. There's still risk in the system, and I think it's nothing to do actually, or very little to do with capital buffers or reserve requirements. It's to do with the nature of the global banking system.
Right, and that's interesting, because I have a chart here that shows what banks have been doing in various parts of the world to try and build up their capital buffers since the financial crisis, and they've been instructed to do so by regulators, and many banks have, not all banks, but many banks have. So perhaps they are safer, in Mervyn King's words, but not safe. So you think that we have to be as radical as to actually break up banks?
Yeah.
Are they just too big?
They're too big. They're too and they're too concentrated.
Because we still talk about consolidation solving
there
problems
is, and
in Europe.
in fact, the banking system has become more consolidated since. But it was the global nature of banking which actually produced the crisis. It was the fact that all the banks held each other's sort of, in the end, valueless assets, and so the collapse of one section of it contaminated everyone else just because of their interconnections, and we haven't done enough to break it up, break up the system. I would prefer banks to be more national. The financial system. I would want to control who they could lend to, where they could lend. I would go back to the era of capital controls. I think capital controls must be an essential part of the reform of the banking system.
OK, Matt.
Well, I think that one of the interesting opposing opinions comes from Joseph Ackerman, who says, Donald Trump's America First means that European banks need to get some cross-border mergers going, build up some size, and really, stamp their presence on the global scene. Do you think that that's wrong?
Well, I think these are words. What does it mean? I mean, what you need in order to have safer banking of a global kind is a global regulatory authority. We haven't got that. We haven't got even a proper European regulatory authority, though they've been making steps towards it. So I think if you can't get a global system in order, then a retreat to some form of nationalist economics is almost inevitable. I mean, that's what happened in the 1930s. That was a lesson of the 1930s. Unless you get a global system right, then globalization breaks down.
So you've talked about how the Great Depression of the 30s led to Keynesianism, the 70s stagflation led to monetarism. This has been much talked about at Milton Friedman. And you're saying, what has this financial crisis given us? And you're sort of asking economists to think more creatively and create something new here. Are you disappointed then by how economists have looked back over the last 10 years and maybe not reinvented economics enough?
Well, I think it's very difficult to reinvent economics. It's so entrenched in its fallacies that they're almost impossible to remove. But one of the chief ones has been the belief that the markets will solve all the problems. Leave it to the market. There's been hostility to government intervention. That goes all the way back to Reagan's famous phrase, the government is the problem, not the solution. So you have a deregulated banking system and an allowance of the growth of inequality, which has been absolutely dreadful.
And Trump would probably still say you need the government to step out of the way, hence the big fiscal package and tax cuts.
Tax cuts for the rich. Welfare benefit cuts for the poor. That is not the basis of a healthy economy. You need mass consumption power. You need markets to grow. If you depress real incomes for a large number of people, then inevitably all your quantitative easing, or most of it, goes into speculative activities rather than into production, because you haven't got the market.
Why have, Lord Skidelsky, the U.S. banks been so quick to recover and are now doing so well, while the European banks continue to cut headcount, still have difficulty posting profits, and are trading at like 0.3 times book value. I mean, why are European banks doing so poorly in comparison to the U.S. banks?
Well, of course, the European economy is doing relatively poorly as a whole relative to the United States. I'm not denying there's been a recovery. Of course, we're not in 2009. But the recovery has been patchy. It's also been lopsided, and I think in the lopsided nature of the recovery are the seeds of the next crisis. It hasn't been a sufficiently broadly based economy. Incomes haven't been going up, average incomes, as you would want them to be. Productivity has been stagnating. There's been a lot of lost productive potential, and therefore. And then that has led to huge political upheavals in Europe and in the United States. So what you're getting is a fragile, insecure situation, and that's what worries me. It worries me much more than the fact that, you know, certain sections of the economy are doing well. They always do well before they crash. I mean, that's the point. That's the point of crashes. They crash from a situation where everyone is reasonably optimistic that things are going well.
Lord Skidelsky, is there a burning platform that will result in banks being broken up right now? Is anybody listening to that argument, do you think? Because across the Eurozone, we hear the arguments a lot that they need to consolidate, they need to get bigger, because they're still dealing with a lot of the non-performing loans and bad debts that resulted from the financial crisis.
Yes, I think the momentum for structural reform of the banks was strong in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, and it's waned since then, and more attention has been paid on making them resilient through beefing up their capital requirements and things of that kind. But I think structural reform is very, very important. I would like to see more national banking and more local banking. For example, I would like to see banks not people wanting mortgages not able to borrow from foreign banks.
I've lost IFB.
I would want to make them borrow from their own bank.